900,000 years ago, humanity almost disappeared forever. Not millions, not hundreds of thousands, just around 1,280 ancestors stood between survival and extinction. For over 100,000 years, they clung to life through fire, cooperation, and fragile hope. Every one of us alive today carries their DNA, their scars, and their resilience. This is not just history, it is the narrow path that made us human. If stories like this make you see humanity differently, support the channel by subscribing. Drop your city and time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're watching from. Let's explore history together, one story at a time. In 2023, a team of population geneticists working in Beijing published a finding that startled even their own discipline. By running thousands of genomes through a new computational method called FitCol, they saw a collapse in the genetic record, a sudden contraction of ancestral diversity around 900,000 years ago. The data suggested that the human lineage had once narrowed to an effective population size of just 1,280 breeding individuals, sustained not for decades, but for over 100,000 years. An effective population is not the same as a head count. The actual number may have been larger, but the signal was stark. When compared with other primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, even small bands of monkeys, the diversity among modern humans is unusually thin. The team realized they were staring at the mark of a genetic bottleneck. One researcher later recalled, "At first we thought it must be an error, but every model, every rerun, told the same story." For decades, biologists had speculated that humans carried the trace of ancient reductions in numbers. Our low variation relative to our vast spread across the globe was always suspicious. Yet until 2023, no one had been able to pinpoint when or how severe. Now, the data placed the crisis at the dawn of the Middle Pleistocene, a geological period when the climate shifted into a harsher rhythm of ice and drought. The implication was that early human ancestors teetered at the edge of disappearance, trapped in what evolutionary science calls the extinction vortex. The consequences of such a squeeze were enormous, with populations that small, random disasters, inbreeding, and loss of genetic diversity can easily drive a species into permanent extinction. In most cases, that is exactly what happens. Yet, the ancestors of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, somehow endured. Their survival meant that every living human today descends from a line that once numbered fewer than the occupants of a small village. This hypothesis is still debated. Fossil evidence from this time is scarce. Anthropologists call it the fossil gap, and genetics alone cannot reveal where these survivors lived or how they sustained themselves. Some argue that the bottleneck may not have been as severe, or that it affected only a portion of early human populations. But the consistency of the genetic models cannot be ignored. Whether the survivors clustered around ancient lakes in East Africa or along rivers that defied drought remains an open question. What is clear is that the genetic echo still shapes us. Humans lost much of their ancestral diversity in this period. Estimates suggest as much as two-thirds of it. That loss explains certain modern vulnerabilities, our comparatively weak immune systems, our unusual susceptibility to particular diseases, and the persistence of rare genetic disorders that would otherwise have been diluted in larger populations. These weaknesses, paradoxically, are also the signatures of survival, but survival did not mean stasis. In populations so small, evolution behaves differently. Beneficial mutations can sweep through the entire group quickly, while harmful ones are also exposed more brutally. This may have been the crucible in which some defining human traits were sharpened: problem-solving ability, cooperation, and the systematic passing of knowledge. Over thousands of generations, those who adapted to shifting climates and collapsing food webs became the genetic core of all who came later. Even our very chromosomes bear the memory of that time. Humans have 46. Our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, have 48. The difference comes from a fusion event that produced our chromosome 2. Some researchers propose that this fusion became fixed during the bottleneck, when a rare genetic change could spread through the whole population within just a few generations. Today, every human carries that fused chromosome, a molecular scar from an age. When survival depended on fragile continuity, the discovery of this bottleneck challenges how we think about the human story. For years, textbooks spoke of gradual adaptation, upright posture, stone tools, migration out of Africa. But this genetic signal tells us something more precarious. Humanity was not simply a triumphant march forward. It was a gamble that nearly failed, balanced on numbers so low they could have been erased by a single volcanic eruption, a single epidemic, or a single generation of drought. And yet it did not fail. Somewhere in Africa, against worsening odds, a few thousand scattered people endured. They hunted what remained, gathered what they could, and passed knowledge carefully, as if guarding a flame from the wind. Every generation that followed carried not only the genes of survival, but also the memory of endurance written into DNA itself. The finding is not just about the distant past, it reframes how we understand ourselves today. We are more genetically alike than any large mammal should be, not because of superiority, but because once we were nearly gone. What diversity we lost in numbers, we gained in strategies, cooperation, adaptability, and resilience. The story that begins here is not one of abundance, but of fragility. It is the record of a species born through crisis, forced to evolve not for dominance, but simply to survive. And it leaves us with the question, what world could have forced our ancestors into such a narrow passage, and how did they endure it for so long? That question leads directly to the climate shift of the Middle Pleistocene, the next chapter in humanity's precarious story. Around 900,000 years ago, the Earth shifted into a new rhythm. Before this turning, ice ages had followed a relatively gentle pulse, 41,000 years of cold followed by warmth, a cycle tough but predictable. But something in the planet's orbital mechanics changed. The cycles lengthened to a brutal pattern of roughly 100,000 years. Glaciations grew deeper, seas dropped lower, droughts lasted longer. For Africa, cradle of human evolution, the result was catastrophic. Rain patterns faltered. Woodlands that had once supported game and fruit slowly withered into savanna, then into scrub, and finally into bare earth. Rivers ran only part of the year or disappeared altogether. Large herbivores that humans relied on began to vanish. And when the animals thinned, predators thinned too. At the base of the chain, human ancestors, already fragile in number, were forced into decisions of mobility and adaptation that carried no guarantee of success. This was the early Middle Pleistocene transition, one of the most severe climatic upheavals of the last 2 million years. To modern scientists, the geological record shows it clearly. Ice sheets in the north ballooning across continents, sea levels plunging hundreds of feet, deep sea cores registering dramatic swings in ocean temperature. To our ancestors, it would not have looked like data. It would have looked like familiar valleys drying, animal migrations failing, and food becoming a constant uncertainty. In such conditions, survival depended on flexibility. Populations that specialized, those who hunted one kind of prey or gathered in a single region, were punished by extinction. The bands that endured were those that became dietary generalists. They ate insects, roots, tubers, reptiles, bird eggs, anything that could yield calories. Archaeologists studying this period find evidence of charred plant remains and fragmented bones from small animals, suggesting groups were squeezing every possible resource from their landscapes. Fire became more than a tool. It was lifeline technology. Controlled use of fire appears in the archaeological record around this time, and for good reason. Fire allowed calories to be extracted more efficiently from scarce foods, killed parasites in meat, and softened starchy plants. It extended the day into the night, offering precious hours to repair tools, share knowledge, and reinforce fragile social bonds. Without it, scattered bands may not have lasted the long glacial droughts, but the pressure was not only ecological. Numbers mattered. With effective population sizes so low, a single epidemic, a predator attack, or even a violent dispute could alter the fate of a group forever. This fragility demanded new strategies of cooperation. Fossil evidence is thin, but comparative anthropology suggests that early humans in this era must have invested heavily in social cohesion. In groups of 20 to 30, conflict resolution, food sharing, and care for the young or injured were not virtues. They were survival strategies. The climate's violence left its trace in stone as well. Toolkits from this period become more standardized, hinting that knowledge was not just invented but taught and transmitted. A hand axe shape repeated across thousands of miles suggests that techniques were being preserved and copied, even when populations were scattered in small communities. The death of a single skilled napper could mean the loss of vital knowledge. Teaching became a form of insurance, a way of keeping the group's memory alive against the attrition of hunger and disease. Scientists describe this period as a perfect storm for extinction. And for most lineages, that was the outcome. Genetic evidence shows that human diversity was cut to a fraction of what it had been. While some animal populations adapted by migrating or diversifying, many human groups collapsed entirely, leaving only faint traces in stone or not at all. The ancestors of modern humans survived, but just barely, and not by strength alone. They survived by stretching into ecological niches, by learning to cooperate, and by carrying knowledge forward like flame. The fossil gap between 950,000 and 650,000 years ago is telling. Few human remains have been found from this span, and those that exist are scattered across Europe and Asia rather than Africa. The absence does not mean our ancestors vanished completely, but that their numbers were so small, the odds of preservation became vanishingly low. The genetic record fills in what bones cannot, a bottleneck lasting more than 100,000 years. When survival was a rare exception rather than the rule, even in their scarcity, these survivors may have laid foundations that shaped the species to come. Small populations magnify the effects of natural selection, a trait that offers even a slight advantage: better memory of seasonal water holes, keener social perception, more efficient tool-making spreads quickly when there are only hundreds of breeding individuals. Over thousands of generations, those traits become embedded, shaping the line that would one day become us. Historians often warn against seeing inevitability in survival. There was nothing preordained about humanity's escape from this climatic vice. Most species that endure such pressure vanish. Yet our lineage endured less through dominance than through resilience. As one geneticist put it when the 2023 study was published, the odds were against us. But those few thousand made them irrelevant. This endurance reframes human history. We often tell our origins as a story of progress tools improving, migrations succeeding, cultures expanding, but the bottleneck suggests something starker: survival through loss, adaptation born of scarcity, and lessons carved from disaster. The climate of the Middle Pleistocene did not reward conquest. It punished it. It favored those who could bend, those who could endure, and those who could find unity in numbers too small to survive division. When the cycles of ice and drought finally eased, humanity would expand again. Populations would grow, lineages would diverge, and the fragile flame carried through the bottleneck would ignite into the many species of human that shared the planet in later millennia. But before the rebound, there was only the squeeze-in age when the Earth itself seemed intent on pushing our ancestors to the edge. It is this crucible of climate and scarcity that explains the genetic scar we all carry today, and it sets the stage for the next chapter: how firelight, cooperation, and the social brain turned fragile survival into the groundwork for culture. By the time humanity's numbers had dwindled to their narrowest point, survival no longer depended on muscle or instinct alone. The climate had stripped away abundance, forcing our ancestors to live within margins that left no room for waste or error. In this setting, cooperation became not just helpful but decisive. Fire, knowledge, and the mind's ability to read and teach others turned fragile groups into something more resilient than their size suggested. Archaeological traces point to fire as a transformative technology during this period. Charcoal deposits, and burned bones from sites in Africa and the Levant suggest that hominins were controlling fire systematically by around 800,000 years ago. This timing coincides with the slow end of the bottleneck, leading many researchers to suspect that fire was one of the tools that allowed recovery. With it, calories hidden in tough roots or raw meat could be unlocked. Nutrients became more digestible, parasites destroyed, and energy conserved. In small populations, even modest nutritional advantages could mean the difference between persistence and extinction, but fire was more than calories. It created time. Without light, most activity ended at sunset. With fire, evenings extended into hours where tools could be sharpened, hides scraped, and strategies shared. Around campfires, human ancestors may have first rehearsed the habit that later defined our species, passing on complex information. Knowledge did not just accumulate by chance. It was transmitted deliberately as bands recognized that the death of a skilled individual could mean the loss of techniques the group could not afford to forget. Standardization in stone tools supports this view. Acheulean hand axes and other implements from this era appear in remarkably consistent shapes across vast regions, from East Africa to Europe. The repetition suggests not just invention but instruction methods learned, copied, and preserved across generations. In groups so small, the ability to teach effectively was as crucial as the ability to hunt. Here lies one of the profound consequences of the bottleneck. With populations scattered in fragile bands of 20 or 30, every individual mattered. Conflict that might fracture a larger society could cripple a small one. Cooperation, fairness, and dispute resolution became strategies of survival. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherers today note similar patterns. Groups under ecological stress tend to emphasize sharing and mutual care. It is reasonable to believe that early humans did the same. This relentless need for cooperation shaped minds. The evolutionary record shows that during this long period, brain size began to increase modestly. More significant than volume, however, was the development of social cognition, the ability to understand what others knew, intended, or believed. Psychologists call this the theory of mind, and it allows groups to coordinate at a depth few other species achieve. In an environment where every mistake risked collapse, knowing who could be trusted, who needed help, and how best to divide scarce labor was a matter of survival. We catch glimpses of this in the fossil record. Endocast's internal impressions of skull show gradual reorganization in brain regions associated with social behavior and planning. The timing is approximate, but consistent with a period when selection pressure for cooperative intelligence would have been at its peak. The bottleneck acted as a crucible, amplifying traits that allowed fragile bands to function smoothly in hostile landscapes. Fire also provided protection. Predators that once stalked hominin groups at night were repelled by flame. This safety allowed for longer sleep and possibly more complex dreaming and memory. Consolidation, another subtle advantage in the refinement of cognition. Around fires, bonds were reinforced. Trust could be built not only through shared food, but through shared stories, however rudimentary they may have been. Some researchers argue that this was the dawn of cultural convergence. Different groups, though separated by distance, began to use tools in increasingly similar ways. The spread of standardized designs implies contact, exchange, or at least observation. Even across scattered landscapes, networks must have formed primitive exchanges of mates, materials, or methods that kept knowledge circulating. This would explain how small groups avoided stagnation despite their isolation. In such conditions, innovation spread quickly. A new way of striking stone, a method for locating tubers, or a strategy for conserving embers could ripple through metapopulations. Evolutionary biologists note that in tiny groups, both genes and ideas move faster. A single insight, if it improves survival, could become universal within just a few generations. The same was true of genetic changes. Beneficial variants were amplified, harmful ones exposed. The bottleneck compressed the pace of both cultural and biological evolution. We also see the shadows of resilience in care. Evidence from later Pleistocene fossils shows healed injuries and disabilities, proof that individuals were looked after rather than abandoned. Though these finds are younger than the bottleneck itself, they suggest a long-standing tendency. Cooperation extended beyond the able-bodied. In groups this small, the survival of one member could not be casually discarded. Caring for the injured or elderly was not sentimentality. It was strategy. Their knowledge could sustain others even if their strength did not dot in the long nights of the bottleneck. Around flickering fires, humanity's inheritance was forged. Cooperation, teaching, and cultural continuity became central. The scars of low-diversity disease susceptibility, genetic disorders were balanced by the strength of shared knowledge and trust. We are the descendants of those who survived. By learning not just to endure the world, but to endure it together. When scientists examine the genetic evidence today, they are struck by how close it came to ending. Yet they are equally struck by what was preserved. The capacity for language, the habit of cooperation, the reliance on knowledge passed between generations, all of these were sharpened here. As one researcher reflected when the bottleneck findings were first published, our species was shaped less by conquest than by constraint. We survived because we learned to share. The firelight of the Middle Pleistocene did more than warm, cold nights. It illuminated a path through scarcity, kept bands together, and set the stage for what would follow. For when the climate shifted again and resources expanded, these habits would not vanish. They would multiply, fueling the recovery and expansion of humanity after the long squeeze. When the long squeeze of the bottleneck finally began to ease, the change was not sudden. The world did not warm in a single season, nor did rivers begin flowing overnight. Instead, over thousands of years, rainfall patterns stabilized, grasslands expanded, and animal populations slowly recovered. For human ancestors who had endured nearly 117,000 years of scarcity, these shifts opened new doors. From scattered survival, a quiet expansion began. Genetic modeling shows that around 813,000 years ago, populations started to grow again. The numbers were still small at first, but even modest increases meant safety and greater redundancy. Groups could split, migrate, and still remain viable. Knowledge once hoarded by a fragile few could now circulate more widely. With each new generation, the flame carried through the bottleneck burned brighter. Fueling a rebound that would reshape human history, the archaeological record reflects this moment of release. Acheulean hand axes and other stone tools proliferated across Africa and Eurasia, becoming more diverse and regionally adapted. These were not the inventions of a single genius, but the shared product of larger, more connected populations. As groups fanned out, they began experimenting with their environments again, testing new diets, refining hunting strategies, and broadening the range of resources they could exploit. This was also the era when early humans began to form metapopulations, networks of small groups linked by exchange and movement. No single band could survive every drought or epidemic, but connected groups created resilience. If one community failed, others could send migrants to refill the gap. Genes flowed between populations, preventing the worst effects of inbreeding. Ideas moved just as quickly. Techniques for fire, for stonework, for locating water rippling through landscapes and stabilizing fragile communities. It is from this period that the ancestors of multiple human lineages likely emerged. Genetic evidence suggests that the populations rebounding from the bottleneck would eventually diverge into at least three branches. Those that remained in Africa and evolved into Homo sapiens, those that moved into Europe and became Neanderthals, and those that spread across Asia to become the enigmatic Denisovans. Their differences would grow with distance and time, but all three carried the same genetic scar of low diversity. All were products of the same crucible of endurance. For the first time in over 100,000 years, there was space for growth. Groups expanded into valleys and coasts long abandoned, following herds that returned with the grasslands. Rivers that had been dustbeds once again offered water and fish. Archaeological finds suggest that shelters became more elaborate and hunting strategies more coordinated. Population growth did not mean immediate abundance. but it allowed for risk-taking that had been impossible during the squeeze. The rebound also reinforced the importance of culture. With more groups, the chances of innovation increased. A new way of striking stone or preparing food might be discovered in one band and passed to others. The record shows subtle regional traditions, slight variations in tool design or subsistence strategies that suggest communities were beginning to establish distinct identities, even as they remain part of a broader genetic and cultural network. This growth marked a turning point. For millennia, survival had been about not dying finding just enough food, enough water, enough cohesion to keep the group alive. After the bottleneck, survival could once again mean living differently. Experimenting, exploring, even competing. The foundation had been laid for the evolutionary experiments that would give rise to later human species. Each adapted to its own corner of the world, and yet the fragility of those origins remained. Genetic studies show that despite population recovery, humans retained only a fraction of the diversity they once had. The loss was permanent. It is why humans today are more genetically uniform than chimpanzees scattered across Central Africa. The bottleneck had pruned the tree of humanity severely, and every branch that grew afterwards sprang from the same narrowed stem for modern science. This realization reframes the narrative of human expansion. We often imagine growth as inevitable, driven by intelligence or technology. But the truth is more precarious. Expansion was only possible because a few thousand individuals endured the worst climate crisis of the era, passing on just enough genetic and cultural material to rebuild. We are their descendants, not because of triumph, but because of persistence. As one archaeologist noted while reviewing the bottleneck study, the remarkable thing is not that humans grew. It's that they held on long enough to have the chance. The Middle Pleistocene was full of species that did not. Fossil records tell of predators and prey alike that vanished as ecosystems shifted. Humanity's survival was not guaranteed. It was a rare exception. The easing of climate stress around 813,000 years ago offered a reprieve, but it did not erase the lessons of scarcity. Fire, cooperation, teaching, and adaptability remained at the core of human survival strategies. These habits, forged when the population hovered near extinction, became the building blocks of resilience in the ages to come. As populations multiplied, the trajectory of human evolution changed. What had once been a fragile line of survivors became the seedbed for diversity, culture, and expansion. Out of the narrows of the bottleneck, humanity emerged carrying both the scars of loss and the habits of resilience, ready to take on new landscapes, new challenges, and new transformations. The next chapter would show what happened when these survivors encountered others shaped by the same crucible: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually ourselves. As populations recovered after the long bottleneck, the human story did not unfold as a single line. Instead, it branched. From the same narrowed stem grew multiple lineages, each adapted to its own environments, yet all carrying the genetic scars of near extinction. By the time conditions stabilized in the Middle Pleistocene, at least three distinct paths had begun to take shape: the ancestors of modern humans in Africa, the Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and the Denisovans in the East. For hundreds of thousands of years, these groups would evolve separately, only to meet again in complex encounters that shaped the humanity we know today. The Neanderthals were the first of these cousins to diverge. Moving north into colder, seasonal environments, they adapted with robust bodies built for endurance and heat retention. Their skeletal remains revealed dense bones, powerful muscles, and large nasal passages suited for icy air. Far from the caricature of brutish cavemen, they were specialists superbly equipped for Ice Age Europe. Their brains were as large or larger than ours, suggesting intelligence equal in potential but directed toward different ecological challenges. To the east, the Denisovans emerged. Their fossil record is fragmentary, mostly teeth and a few bone fragments discovered in Siberia's Denisova cave, but their genetic legacy tells a broader story. Denisovans spread widely across Asia, leaving DNA traces in populations from Tibet to Oceania. Some of their genetic contributions remain vital. The EPAS1 gene variant, inherited by modern Tibetans, helps the body use oxygen efficiently at high altitudes. This adaptation, carried across millennia, still enables survival on the roof of the world. Meanwhile, the lineage that would become Homo sapiens remained in Africa. Here, fluctuating climates demanded flexibility rather than specialization. While Neanderthals perfected cold-weather strategies and Denisovans spread into vast territories, African populations faced continual change. Rainfall patterns shifted, ecosystems swung between wet and dry, and food sources never stabilized for long. In this unstable environment, adaptability itself became the key to survival. Toolkits changed more rapidly, diets broadened, and social networks grew larger to hedge against risk. For centuries, these lineages developed apart, each shaped by local demands, but isolation was never complete. The archaeological and genetic record makes clear that when these groups encountered each other, they did not always compete to the death, they also interbred. Modern humans carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA, and many populations in Asia and Oceania carry up to 6% Denisovan ancestry. These fragments are not trivial. They include immune system genes that help fight pathogens, and metabolic adaptations that allowed survival in extreme environments. Encounters with cousins were therefore not simply collisions, they were exchanges. When modern humans migrated out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they entered territories already occupied. Sometimes conflict followed as groups competed for resources. But sometimes cooperation and interbreeding left a genetic legacy that endures in our bodies today. Humanity, in its modern form, is not the product of one lineage alone, but of blended inheritances. The contrast between these lineages also illuminates why Homo sapiens eventually outlasted the others. Neanderthals and Denisovans were extraordinary, survivors in their own domains, but they were specialists. When climates shifted or ecosystems collapsed, specialization became vulnerability. Neanderthals, dependent on large Ice Age game, struggled when those herds diminished. Denisovans, adapted to specific terrains, could not expand into every niche. By contrast, sapiens had been forged in the instability of Africa. Our ancestors had already learned to live with volatility, to innovate quickly, and to rely on broad diets and flexible strategies. Archaeology highlights this difference. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans developed what is called the Upper Paleolithic toolkit blade technologies: bone needles, fishing gear, and more complex hunting weapons. These innovations represented not just cleverness but scalability. Smaller groups could achieve what once required larger ones, giving modern humans efficiency advantages in contested environments. Neanderthals, by contrast, used similar stone tool technologies for hundreds of thousands of years with little change. Their methods worked until they did not, but to frame the story purely as a competition misses its nuance. For tens of thousands of years, humans and their cousins coexisted. They shared landscapes, exchanged genes, and likely learned from one another. Burial practices associated with Neanderthals, for example, suggest symbolic thought. Denisovan seafaring hints at technological sophistication. Modern humans were not the sole bearers of complexity. Instead, they were the lineage that most successfully carried complexity forward as environments changed. What unites all three groups is the legacy of the bottleneck. Each carried reduced diversity, each bore the mark of survival under constraint, and each refined human traits under pressure, intelligence, social cooperation, and cultural transmission. When their paths crossed again, it was not as strangers but as distant relatives, all forged in the same evolutionary furnace. Today, their presence remains with us. The shape of a jaw, the capacity to survive thin air, the immune response to pathogens, these are fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry living in modern populations. They remind us that our story is not one of pure descent, but of mixture, adaptation, and inheritance across lineages. We are not the only humans who once lived. We are simply the ones who endured. The encounters of cousins tell us something broader. About survival. Success in human history has rarely belonged to the strongest or the most specialized. It has belonged to the most flexible, the most cooperative, and the most inventive. Those qualities, sharpened in Africa's volatility, carried sapiens outward, allowed them to blend with cousins, and ultimately enabled their expansion to every corner of the world, the crossroads of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans. Were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of global humanity, where exchange, competition, and adaptation merged into a single, expanding lineage. The lessons of those encounters remain clear. Survival was never inevitable. It was won through adaptability, cooperation, and the capacity to absorb difference rather than resist it. The discovery of humanity's near extinction is more than a scientific curiosity. It is a reminder that survival is never guaranteed. Around 900,000 years ago, our lineage came closer to vanishing than at any other point in its history. The scars of that crisis are written into every genome alive today, shaping both our vulnerabilities and our strengths. The bottleneck is not just a chapter in prehistory, it is part of who we are. One of the clearest legacies is our unusual genetic uniformity. Despite numbering more than 8 billion today, humans are far less diverse than many species with populations in the tens of thousands. Chimpanzees across Africa show more genetic variation between groups than exists between people on different continents. This lack of diversity makes us more vulnerable to disease. Pathogens can exploit shared weaknesses, spreading faster and causing more damage than they might in a species with broader genetic defenses. Epidemics, from smallpox to influenza to COVID-19, echo this fragility, yet the same bottleneck that left us exposed also selected for resilience in other ways. In small populations, traits that improved cooperation and knowledge transfer were amplified. Groups that shared food, cared for the injured, and taught survival skills endured longer than those that did not. Over tens of thousands of years, this pressure shaped us into a species unusually skilled at collaboration. Our ability to live in groups of hundreds, even thousands, far exceeds that of other primates, whose communities typically collapse beyond a few dozen. The roots of cities, nations, and global cooperation trace back to survival habits forged in scarcity. The bottleneck also accelerated cultural evolution. When every individual mattered, knowledge could not be left to chance. Skills had to be preserved and transmitted with precision. This emphasis on teaching created a foundation for cumulative culture, the gradual building of knowledge across generations. From stone tools to agriculture, from oral traditions to written language, the human tendency to preserve and share expertise is a direct extension of this ancient necessity. Even our intelligence may owe something to those desperate millennia. Cognitive scientists note that the challenges of surviving in unstable climates, finding water, tracking game, predicting weather, and managing conflict would have strongly favored problem-solving ability. In populations this small, individuals who could think flexibly and communicate effectively had an outsized impact on survival. Over thousands of generations, selection for these skills may have laid the groundwork for the larger brains and complex reasoning that define Homo sapiens today. The legacy is not only biological, it is philosophical. Knowing that every person alive descends from perhaps 1,280 breeding individuals reframes ideas of human difference. Whatever divisions we have created, race, language, nation, are recent and superficial. In evolutionary terms, we are all close cousins. The bottleneck discovery undercuts any notion of deep biological separation. Humanity emerged from the same narrow passage, carrying the same survival-tested genes, the same scars of fragility, and the same potential for resilience. This unity has practical implications. Global challenges, climate change, pandemics, resource scarcity mirror in different form the pressures our ancestors faced. The lesson of the bottleneck is that survival depends less on strength than on adaptability and cooperation. Our ancestors endured because they learned to share, to innovate, and to find stability in unstable environments. Those same habits are essential now as the planet enters a new period of rapid change. The The story also cautions against complacency. Survival was not inevitable. For more than 100,000 years, human ancestors lived on the edge, their future determined by forces beyond their control. Other species with similar challenges disappeared. That we are here at all is extraordinary, but it is not destiny. The bottleneck is both warning and proof. Warning that success can be undone by environmental crisis. Proof that even against impossible odds, survival is possible through resilience and cooperation. As one researcher reflected when the 2023 study was published, we are here not because we were guaranteed to be, but because a few thousand people found ways to hold on. Their endurance, stretched across generations, gave rise to every life alive today. The bottleneck is over, but its legacy endures. It lives in our chromosomes, in our social instincts, in our vulnerability to disease, and in our capacity for innovation. It explains why we are so similar and why cooperation runs deep in our species. Most of all, it reminds us that we are the descendants of survivors, not conquerors of the earth, but fragile beings who once nearly vanished and who learned, through firelight and memory, how to endure together. Before you go, if this story meant something to you, like it, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's spread these moments together.